How do we interpret Russia's war aggression against Ukraine? Is it Putin's war, as some politicians say, or is it a war of the Russian people? Do Russians support the war? If they don't, why are they not protesting more? Do their vocal or tacit approval of the invasion, or even fearful silence, make them collectively responsible for the aggression? What psychological defense mechanisms do some Russian citizens use to avoid responsibility for the war against Ukraine? My name is Anton Shekhovtsov, I'm director of the Center for Democratic Integrity, and I'm discussing all these questions with a great colleague of mine, Andreas Umland, an analyst with the Stockholm Center for Eastern European Studies. This is a new project of ours, Café Eurasia, and I hope you will find our discussion insightful. If you do, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We have more important topics to talk about. By the way, you can suggest interesting topics for us to discuss in the future in the comments to this video. Stay safe and stay tuned for updates. Andreas, I'm so glad to see you again. We continue our project, Café Eurasia. I think the first episode, the pilot episode, was quite good. People were interested, so let's continue talking. It may be a little bit noisy in this video because we are in the center of Berlin again. It's the Alexanderplatz, named, as you say.
I think it's named after the Tsar, Alexander I.
The Russian Tsar, Alexander I. And last time we were talking about the potential breakup of the Russian Federation. I don't think that we were sort of insisting on the need of the breakup of Russia. We just analyzed different patterns and different potential developments. But today I want us to talk about two different approaches towards the war that started almost exactly a year ago, or the escalation of the war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine, the Russian aggression against Ukraine. And these two approaches, maybe these are two maximalist approaches, but still they're quite relevant. One approach is that this aggression, this escalation can be considered a Putin's war. Yeah, and the second approach is to call this war the Russian people's war, or the Russian war. Not just Putin's, but actually a Russian war. And I'll start here from, since we're in Germany, I'll start from this quote from Olaf Scholz, Chancellor Olaf Scholz, who, just following the beginning of the escalation at the end of February last year, he said that it was Putin's war. Yeah, and I think his idea, at least at that time, was to somehow support those people in Russia who were against the war. And probably there was this hope that not necessarily an uprising, but a protest against the war would lead Putin to stop it, or at least, not go full scale. And he, in particular, said that Germany stood by the side of all those in Russia who who were standing up to Putin's regime. And his quote: "We know that there are many of you, and to all of you I say, don't give up." So do you remember those discussions in Germany?
Yes, and I actually want to return the question and ask you what you thought at this point in late February. Were you sort of expecting something to happen? Because I was also hopeful, I must say. I thought this is something that maybe Putin has gone too far, and there were some protests. You remember, there were in St. Petersburg, in Moscow, but eventually they turned out to be minor and they didn't catch up. They didn't. But what was your feeling then? Was there something to be expected?
Well, for me, obviously, the war had started in 2014.
For you especially.
Yeah, for me especially, as a person who was born in Sevastopol. And so for me, it was not really surprising, what was happening. But I already had a feeling that it was not only Putin's war. I had this feeling even before, before the escalation. But I must agree, I did hope for the protest in Russia, because the scale of the aggression, I thought it just unbelievable. You know, it's too much.
Yeah, especially the attacks on Kharkiv, on Kiev. I was I mean, we had with a colleague, John Zachau, we had actually in January last year, almost exactly a year ago, a scenario analysis where we had as the third scenario an attack, a full-scale attack. But I was actually believing in another scenario where we had a sort of a limited war in the Donbass, something that is now actually at this moment in early February in 2023 happening. But that there would be an attack even on Kiev, and that Kiev would be bombed was something for me unbelievable, and was very different from the annexation of Crimea, which went largely without armed aggression, then the pseudo-civil war, which was a good theater. But now this was not theater anymore. This was just open, conventional, just traditional expansionist war. And I thought, you know, the Russians, you know, this is, you know, the old song Хотят, русские, войны, yeah, and it turned out Хотят. The song, of course, in translation, do the Russians want war? Yeah, and then, you know, it's all this pathos that, you know, you should ask the veteran, you should ask this person, and do the Russians really want war? And that it turns out they want war. If you provide a nice narrative for it, you can actually bomb even Kiev. The mother of all Russian cities, as it said. I mean, that was something I thought there should be something. I thought this is unbelievable, but it turns out it's more popular than I thought.
And well, you mentioned this song whether Russians want war, but there is this also an argument and saying, I think from the times of the Cold War, one. Apparently, I don't remember this exactly, but apparently one Soviet general would say, no, in the future there will be no war, but there will be a struggle for peace that will destroy the world, you know. And they do have this argument about, you know, we are not fighting the war, we are struggling for peace through this special military operation.
We cannot help to do it.
This the double speak or new speak that they're using, But no, at that time, I must say I was disillusioned. I was disappointed in many people. You know, for me, as a person, as a Russian speaker, it was quite traumatic as well, because I cut ties with some of my quite close friends because of this. Not necessarily they supported the war. That was not, well, I never had those friends or contacts, but I believe that the people were not doing enough to stop it. And that was, at that time, you know, when I saw the level and the scale of destruction, I thought, well, you remember there was this time, well, before the escalation, it was just almost like a code word. You had to ask a person where Crimea belongs to, Russia or Ukraine, and the right answer, of course, was Ukraine. But after February last year, it was not enough. It just was not enough to say that Crimea belongs to Ukraine. No, I mean, what do you do in order to stop this, in order to prevent this from happening? And of course, Scholz, at that time, he was not aware of the public sentiments, of the public, what the public thought. And there is this public opinion poll, well, a series of public opinion polls by the Levada Center. Of course, I'm sure you will agree that it's quite tricky to measure those public opinions in an authoritarian state. But the numbers, they're quite stable. At least what the Levada Center can show is I would say the stability of the trend. So starting from March last year, where, well, apparently the support was 78%, general support. And it would drop a little bit in September after the start of the partial mobilization. Obviously, some people freaked out that it's not the war only on the TV, but actually they can themselves individually die in the war. It dropped, but 72%. And then in January this year, 75. Again, I'm not saying that these numbers are true, but at least the trends are showing that there is support and quite considerable.
Yeah. Yeah, but what would you say? I mean, there are these classical questions of measurement in social science. It's about reliability. Are these results reliable? Will they always, or will they, under similar circumstances, be replicated? And then there's the questions of validity. Do the questions actually, or do the methods that you apply actually measure what you claim to measure, or do they not measure something else? You know, I mean, the classical example here is from our field, racism and anti-Semitism studies, that if you ask somebody, are you a racist or an anti-Semit, most people would say, no, I'm not, but that's an invalid, and it may be a reliable answer, because they will always say that, but it may be an invalid answer, because if you have these sort of more complicated questions where you ask, would you mind having a black person as a neighbor or something like that, and then you get actually more validity of the question. And here I'm still, maybe it's a somewhat too optimistic view, I'm still somewhat hopeful that perhaps the measurement is either not reliable or is at least partially invalid. And that maybe Levada is measuring here something that with a different method of measurement would produce a different result, or that it is measuring something else, that it's measuring some sort of outside stance of Russians, that perhaps in the kitchen they would talk differently. But in an opinion poll, they say this, so they are not actually measuring what they are claiming to measure, but that it's a partially, at least, invalid measurement. So I'm still hoping for that, but maybe you are of a different opinion.
Well, yeah, I would say, well, not only this, but also probably some people are afraid of saying what they think. You know, you have a call from a pollster, and you can never know for sure in Russia who is calling you, and you ask these questions. But there is several things. Well, first, all those really strict laws that basically criminalized the protest against the war, they came after some of those public opinion polls. So, for example, there was a public opinion poll by the Levada Center at the end of February 22. So before, if I'm not mistaken, before those laws were adopted, and already then you had 68% of the support. And the question was, I mean, obviously they didn't ask, do you support killing of Ukrainians? Yeah, they asked whether you supported the actions of the Russian army in Ukraine, the special operation, all the actions, well, everybody knows what they're doing there. Yes. There is another interesting point that one could take from the results of the Levada Center polls. You have this difference between the numbers who support the war, and there is a difference in age. So the younger the people are, the less support they have for the war. But the longer they lived in the Soviet Union, the more support for the war there is. And I think this is yet another argument about how this Soviet mindset, this imperialistic mindset that was nurtured in the Soviet Union, how it actually affects what views they have today. But there is another public opinion.
That's a good argument for the validity, actually, because that is something you would expect, that the older ones would have. So that actually seems to indicate that there is really something valid here. Mm-hmm.
But there is another result, again by the Levada Center poll, that I would say, well, first it is also very close to the topic of our discussion, but also it validates some of the findings. Again, this may be controversial. Again, we're talking about the polling in an authoritarian regime. So there was a public opinion poll about moral responsibility. So the question was, do you think that people like you bear moral responsibility for the deaths of civilians and destruction in Ukraine? And the numbers are quite stable. In April last year, 65% said they didn't have that responsibility. Yeah? In May, 58, in August, 60, in December last year, 59. So we have 2/3 of the Russian population that says they don't bear any moral responsibility for the killings in Ukraine. So we can combine these results, with the results about the question whether you support the activities of the Russian army in Ukraine. So at least 2/3 of the population, I think we can be sure that they do support the war.
Yeah. This is, of course, an old issue also in Germany, in that people after World War II simply did not acknowledge that there was a Holocaust, and we still have today laws about Holocaust denial, because there is a part of German society that simply says the Holocaust is just an imagination of some American historians or Jewish politicians and so on, and that I suspect something like that is also happening in Russia, that people would simply say, well, we did not kill any civilians. I mean, the civilians were killed by the Ukrainians themselves, and that is the old story about the Donbas war, that allegedly Ukraine sort of attacked itself in the Donbas, and that all the children that were killed in the Donbas are actually victims of Ukrainian weapons. In spite of Girkin admitting that he started the war, we have now research actually by people like Nikolai Mitrokhin or Jakob Hauter, who went into the details of the start of the war and showed that it was actually started by the Girkin group, and that the Girkin group was in contact with the Russian state. So this is all in principle clear, but that I guess there are still many people that they would say, no, perhaps there were civilians killed, but not by our army. We don't kill any civilians. So I would actually be interested in also another question then: do you actually acknowledge that there could be, Ukrainian civilians being killed by Russian soldiers? And then my suspicion is that would be quite a high percentage of people who would say, no, this is just Ukrainian propaganda.
Putin himself admitted that civilians were killed during the war, during this invasion, and he would say, well, there is, of course, it's always a tragedy, this happens, yes. But the sooner the Ukrainian government stops fighting, the less civilian deaths there will be. So this is the perverse argument.
And then oddly, the same logic is not applied to the Donbas pseudo-civil war since 2014, where most people would know about Girkin's famous words, who said, I pulled the trigger, but they would then not acknowledge that Russia started a war in the Donbas that perhaps also led to the killing of civilians, perhaps even by Ukrainian weapons. I wouldn't exclude that. That is the same logic that Putin applies here, and the Red Army, of course, killed when it and the Allied in World War II. They obviously killed civilians, including children, when they liberated Europe from fascism. So you could apply this logic to every war, basically. But there's then this sort of doublethink that here we have a war where perhaps we also inadvertently killed some civilians, but the civilians killed in the war that we triggered in 2014 in the Donbas, they are all ascribed to Ukrainian evilness. So that is I think these are sort of protective psychological mechanisms. It would be perhaps actually something to discuss with a psychologist rather among us political scientists here.
But Putin at the same time, he was actually quite clear about those civilians. If you remember 2014, he said that we would be standing behind the civilians, not in front of them, but behind them. That was a direct quote.
It's outrageous. I know, and people in Russia, they should have. Is he really saying that? I mean, maybe he mixed it up, but I don't think he mixed it up. He meant it, actually.
He meant it. It's basically a terrorist tactic, to be hiding behind the civilians. talking about those defense mechanisms that you mentioned, that you referred to, I think one of those defense mechanisms is what we see now in many pockets of the Russian population. You would have the self-victimization, yeah, presenting themselves as also as victims of the war. You know, in order, and this helps a lot, I think, as a defense mechanism, because there is a consensus that you cannot blame a victim for the crime against them. So if you consider yourself a victim, that you cannot be blamed and then you don't need to share this responsibility for what your country is doing against another sovereign country.
Yeah, the problem with this argument, it could be partly justified, yet now with the harshness of the laws, and that you actually can end up for many years in prison and so on. And if you have not supported the war directly, if you have not fought yourself or sent money, or if you've left actually the country, then you have, of course, less responsibility than if you have sort of supported the war. The problem here is that in a way it would be very easy to stop the war if the Russians would simply go on general strike. So what would be needed is if a few million people would simply stay at home in the morning and do not go to work, you know. And if a few million do that, then you cannot put a few million people into prison. You don't have to go on the street and to fight with the cosmonauts here, with the police people who are dressed like cosmonauts, like astronauts. So and you wouldn't have to go to prison for that. But for some reason, this general strike, that was my hope always, that this would now happen. People would simply say, "I'm not going to work anymore until the war stops," and then and that has not happened. Of course, that's a collective action problem. Also, you know, that's another political science issue, but. You know, there are ways to overcome the collective action problem, you know, and then you have this prisoner's dilemma that people think, well, perhaps others should rather, and if I stay at home, will others stay at home? You know, will we actually, you know, all support each other, or will there be the strike breakers who will then go to work, and then the whole strike will actually not work? But still, this is something that can be, especially with social media, it should be, you know, you can now communicate much easier than, let's say, 80 years ago in Nazi Germany, you know, when. But here you can organize it, and with things like Telegram, you can actually do it even in a fairly secretive way. So you can overcome the collective action problem and the prisoner's dilemma. And apparently nobody has ever tried it seriously, and that's maybe. And that's also then, a part of it is also individual responsibility, because each individual, it's a collective responsibility, it's a problem of Russian civil society, and it's a problem of the post-Soviet condition and so on. But at the end of the day, it comes down to individuals who never apparently really tried to organize a general strike.
But in order to organize this collective action, what is needed in the first place is a society. Not only civil society, but an actual society, which is lacking in Russia.
Yeah, but I wonder how much social media actually would be sufficient, because all you need to do is to communicate. You don't need to gather somewhere. You just have to say, we are doing a general strike, and then send out the message. And please, next Monday, don't go to work. You know, and then if a few million people do that, and basically the economy comes to a halt, and you need, of course, the economy to work for the army to fight, because there's a huge logistic behind it, and so on, and that has never happened. And that
apparently there are some subversive activities in Russia. We see those from time to time.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, these are encouraging, and people are actually risking a lot. And I've also heard that people have been killed already. I mean, that actually, you know, they're risking their lives, their freedom, their health, and so on. But these are small groups, and that is this main thing here.
Yeah, and of course, for many Russians who tried with this, who are trying to use this defense mechanism of self-victimization, some of them go as far as to compare themselves with the Jews in Europe during the Second World War, and basically this is a huge trivialization of the tragedy of the Shoah, of the Holocaust, and it's really, for me at least, it's verging on historical revisionism of what was happening.
It's a scandal. I mean, we had this early in the in 2014. There was, I think, the Russian Foreign Ministry was comparing the Odessa events on 2nd of May 2014 with the Holocaust, which was already quite a scandal, because of course the first two people killed in Odessa on this day were pro-Euromaidan, pro-Ukrainian people, and then the whole thing escalated. And I mean, the suggestion would then be that the Jews first killed the SS people, and then the SS people fought back, and then, well, you know, then sort of, I mean, this is all very tricky comparison here with the and outrageous in a way. And I think it's perhaps again for psychologists to assess that rather than for us as political scientists.
Of course, not everybody in Russia uses these defense mechanisms of self-victimization. There are people who do acknowledge that there is a responsibility, collective responsibility, individual responsibility. And here I want to quote Vladimir Sorokin, who is a living classic. He's a really great Russian author. He recently said that when he was asked about whether he believed in this collective responsibility, individual responsibility, he said that there are both. Yeah? And here's a quote: "As a Russian, I share the collective responsibility for the unleashed war, for the war that was unleashed, but I also have to ask myself what it was specifically that I didn't do to prevent it. All of us Russians will have to drink from the bitter cup. Everyone will have to carry a stone upon their backs. How big and how heavy is for each person to decide individually, but we are all to blame, of course, not just Putin and his team." And you have this contrast between Scholz, Olaf Scholz, and other politicians who insist that it's a Putin's war, and even when it became quite clear, when it was after the revelations of the genocidal massacre in Bucha, in Gostomel, in other places. But still, for some politicians, they would say, well, it's a Putin's war, but you have these leaders, opinion leaders of Russian origin at the very least, who say, yeah, there is this collective responsibility. Do you see hope here?
Yes, that is hopeful. Also, it would make, of course, I mean, Sorokin would probably agree to that there are exceptions. There is, for instance, a Russian legion in the Ukrainian army, Russian citizens who have gone to Ukraine and who are fighting on the Ukrainian side against the invasion. I would also make an exception for those who went out and protested and got fines or got into prison, were beaten up. So I think, it's like with German anti-fascism, at least the people who early on fought against it, I think they can be actually exempted from this collective responsibility. But the quote reminds me of some of my seminars in the early 1990s about German history, where I remember one professor said, well, you could, as a German, you can, of course, leave Germany. You can denounce, give away your German citizenship. You can integrate into another society. You can learn the culture, the language of the other society, and say you are not German. And at least if you have not lived during the Holocaust in Germany, you can then say, well, I'm not responsible because I'm not German anymore. So that is something that I think that is, although now if you lived in Russia on 24th of February, then of course it's already tricky. You cannot easily run away from this responsibility. But still, that you could, of course, denounce your Russianness, your Russian citizenship, your own culture, your own history, and so on. And then you can say, well, I'm not Russian anymore. So, I think the responsibility, there's no direct guilt. I think there
is a difference between guilt and responsibility.
So there's no collective guilt, of course. And again, there are many who are against it, and some who have done against it. Some people who speak out in one way or another, who fight in one way or another against it. So I think there's a range of responsibility and guilt and so on. But the majority, unfortunately, is responsible, and the vast majority of Russians, and that makes it actually a very bizarre phenomenon. Why would you take this responsibility upon yourself? I mean, it's very bad for the Russians themselves. It's also economically very bad. It's really they're going deeper and deeper into this morass, into this moral, economic, political, diplomatic, national morass. And I would even suspect now, the more I've thought after our conversation about the breakup of Russia, that we could end up at a situation where there may even be a new civil war in Russia, between different people who have, who see the war in different ways. So I don't know what will happen, but now I think these issues of guilt and responsibility, and how do we relate to all of the killed people in Ukraine will be a huge problem for Russia.
The person who actually probably validates the idea that there is a collective responsibility of the Russian population for the war of aggression against Ukraine is Putin himself. Because when he makes all those decisions, when he thinks what should be done for the war, he actually delays many very important practical decisions regarding the war, because he thinks that those decisions are unpopular. That he believes that actually people can protest against the war. They can say out loud or by any other means that they don't support those measures. And that influenced his decisions. One example is, of course, this partial mobilization. It was very unpopular, and Putin knew that it was unpopular, and he only had to do this, or he decided to do this eventually after a series of failures on the battlefield. But it does prove that he actually relies on the public opinion in the Russian Federation.
Yeah. I would even go a step further and say that he may be driven by this public opinion, because my impression from the literature is that actually the popularity of the annexation of Crimea was at the end higher than the Kremlin expected. So they already knew that would go well, that would be popular, but then you had this drunkenness of the Russian population. So there were these opinion polls in spring 2014 where people were asked about corruption, and they would suddenly say that Russia is less corrupt than before the annexation. So they had this sort of magic already, this real drunkenness from the annexation, and then this may have also informed then the start of the pseudo-civil war by Girkin as an agent of the Russian state in the Donbass, and that may have also informed now the decision of Putin to actually go for a whole invasion. Although what I hear is a lot that many people in Moscow did not, the experts, the diplomats and so on, even people within the state apparatus, they did not expect that to happen. And they were really surprised then on 24th of February, because they thought, this is ridiculous. Where are we going to go with that? But Putin knew already that this would be popular. He knew that actually. He also knew it from Georgia, from the Georgian War in 2008, when the regime got a push from it. It may be actually not the way that Putin is sort of intoxicating the Russian population, but that there is actually another effect here, that there is a Russian demand for this imperial expansion that then informs actually calculating politicians like Putin.
Where I do believe that there is a difference between Putin's war and the Russian war, between these two concepts, is I think this genocidal aspect is very much Putin's aspect. It would have been different without Putin. For Putin, I think that was really essential, almost existential, for him to fight this genocidal, not just a war of aggression, but a genocidal war of aggression against Ukraine.
I agree, and I guess here the many Russians simply perhaps don't believe what is happening, and they try to tell themselves stories about, that the Ukrainians are doing it themselves, or this is all not true, this is all a theater, and
but they don't believe even their relatives who are based in Ukraine. It's not about the lack of access to information. There is no such lack.
I think that is something that people here often in Germany underestimate, that there is still a lot of communication going on between the two countries, which is much more intense than the information that we get here in the West from. So people, they say, they think that here they understand Russia and so on, but they have no idea, what the Ukrainians basically, they partly live in the Russian communication sphere, as I believe the Estonians, they are much more connected to that although they may have still no accounts now with Vkontakte or some these Russian networks, but there's still a lot of interaction going on, and so I think one of the big problems is simply and the misunderstandings between the Ukrainians and the West Europeans, or let's say the East Europeans and the West Europeans, is that the East Europeans simply know much more about Russia, and they get every day much more information about Russia than many West Europeans, who get this sort of filtered, framed information, usually with a big delay then also, and then they don't understand why the East Europeans are so excited and so on. So this is something that often here is misunderstood, and then the different interpretations in Eastern Europe are then seen as some sort of this is almost
paranoid.
This is almost a crypto-racist. We are here the so-called thinkers and poets in Germany. We know how the world works, but these East Europeans, they are all a bit emotional, so we shouldn't take them too seriously. I mean, that has now declined after 24th of February. I think now there is a lot of rethinking about this going on, and there's I just read a very interesting article in the New Yorker by an American writer and literary critic, Elif Batuman, from the Turkish origins, who used to be in love with Russian literature, and she actually in this essay she's questioning this saying it's Putin and not Pushkin, and she's then sort of rereading Pushkin and Tolstoy. Not so much Tolstoy, but Pushkin, Dostoevsky, and partly also Tolstoy and others, and then saying, well, if you dig into Pushkin and Dostoevsky and so on, then you can see how there is a connection between Pushkin and Putin.
Finally, the question, I think, which is also very important, even if we agree that there is a collective responsibility, not the guilt, but the collective responsibility of the Russians for the aggression. It's not only Putin's war, obviously. What do we do with this?
Well, I think one thing that I've been writing about this for years already is that we should try to somehow reach Russians. I'm always surprised. I have still my account in Vkontakte, and I'm surprised, how many Western institutions are not in Vkontakte. Of course, that's a very difficult thing to do, because one suspects that Vkontakte is now actually controlled by the FSB. Vkontakte used to be, at least, I'm not sure whether that's still the case, the largest social network in Europe, not just in Russia, in Europe, because it has the large Russian and non-Russian. Maybe that has now declined, but it's still a very large social network. And most, Western institutions, they are fine with Twitter and Facebook. They don't care about, because this is something, Russian network, who wants to go there, and so on. And so there's not enough effort of that. And so we haven't, I mean, there's now, people now starting to understand that, but there was too much, until 24th of February last year, too much talk about Western misunderstandings of Putin. We should have much more cared about Russian misunderstandings about Putin. So, for instance, I think the key story here is how Putin got initially popular. These were the famous Moscow bombings of 1999, the bombings in Moscow, Buenos, and Volgodonsk, which were apparently organized by the FSB. And if you could get this story out, that Putin's rise starts with 300 Russian civilians killed in Russia, then if maybe that would be a way then to actually catch the Russians' attention and to make them rethink. It's not about killing Ukrainians, about killing. The whole thing starts with killing Russians, and and then of course if you can kill Russians and that's accepted by the why not kill Ukrainians and Georgians and so on and Syrians. Another way would be a totally different way, is to say, look at what happened to the Germans after World War II. We killed 50 million people, gas chambers, World War and so on. But 15 years after World War II, basically Germany was fully integrated into the West. Member of NATO, member of the European Coal and Steel Community, member of the Council of Europe, totally integrated into Western Europe. You have this chance too. It's just up to you. You have to get away from Putinism, and then you can be part of Europe. You can get an association agreement. You can get a visa-free regime. You can become perhaps even a member of NATO one day. This is all open to you. Germany did it. Look at Germany, and we still, so far at least, we Germans have killed more people than the Nazism has killed more people than Putinism. So there is a chance. And it's up to you to take the opportunity.
Well, I think we mentioned this already. I think that the problem is also that there is no a rethinking of the Soviet crimes that the Soviet Union committed, and those crimes were, well, if we take the Holocaust out of this picture, those crimes could be comparable, these Nazi crimes and the Soviet crimes.
If you would imagine like an alternative history, let's say of the last 30 years with a much more intense discussion of Stalinism in Russia, would you then actually think that could have prevented what we've observed?
I think yes, because, well, you could see the legitimization of Stalinism in the recent years. You could see, Soviet crimes being pictured as victories, as heroic deeds. So you had this. It was not the return of the Soviet Union. I don't think that Putin is trying to restore the Soviet Union, but it's a clear attempt to restore the Soviet might, the Soviet geopolitical might. And you have legitimization of Stalinism, and you have this rationalization of Stalinist crimes and of Soviet crimes, and it feels like people were being prepared for the war through this heroization of the Soviet crimes, of the Soviet deeds.
That reminds me of an argument that Maxim Trudolyubov has been making for many years already, that the key issue in post-Soviet Russia was not perhaps economic or social and so on, but the real issue was the lacking Vergangenheitsbewältigung, the lacking reconsideration of the past, and that then this opens political space also for neo-Sovietism, basically for neo-imperialism, because it hasn't been reflected enough, and this was really the missing element. And I think there is also some blame to put here on the West. We should have more worked in this direction, because there was in the 90s the channels were open. Maybe there was. I'm still struggling with myself to say, was Putin or something like Putin preventable? Most Ukrainians would, of course, say no. I mean, you needed to. What you need really to end this imperialism is a defeat of this imperialism, and a humiliating defeat. And as years go by, I am actually getting closer to this position. But still, in the 90s, I think there was a window at least slightly open to do more, and we did not do as much as we should have done.
I think that the mistake then was that Alexander Yanov wrote about this, that there was too much focus on the economic aspect of democratization, but almost no focus on the political part of the democratization.
The odd thing here was, of course, that this was an ideology, also promoted by people like Gaidar, which were anti-Marxist, but then also deeply Marxist, because there was this sort of the economic foundation and the political superstructure, but we should have really talked more about ideas, about the past, about narratives and so on, and we did not do that enough. Although at the end of the day, I mean, there is this also in Russia now, by some Russian intellectuals, popular blaming of the West, that the West did not do the right thing in the 1990s, is also a sign of escapism.
Yes, but again, you know, what matters here is actually who is saying that the West is to blame. I don't think that actually Russians have a moral right to say that the West is, you know, hasn't done something good for Russia. Russians, I think, I don't know whether you will agree or disagree. Russians now, at the very least now, need to do soul searching. They need to deal with what they are responsible for. But to conclude, I would say that even if we agree that there is a collective responsibility, as you say, probably we should keep on talking to the Russians, because in the end, yes, we need Russia to be defeated, but in the end, the long-term idea about security, it will have to include, you know, Russia being more or less peaceful country, and without reaching out to the Russian population is not going to be possible.
Yeah, I agree.